Hello, everyone. I'm Athena Ullah with STV, and thank you all for still being here because this is a very important topic. Um, I think equity is one of those things that cuts to the cornerstone of why we exist as an industry of what do we do to really be proper fiduciary stewards of our public funding. And so front in mind of all of us on every level of government is, well, how do we do things equitably, considerably. And just 2 weeks ago, President Biden launched a new executive order to re up on the language of equity. And so I'm hoping over the next 40 minutes, we can have a panel discussion on the topic, but then also a larger debate amongst ourselves on how do we really bring this home? Because talking about equity is pretty easy, but working through the what is pretty difficult. So, with here, I want to introduce five wonderful panelists who are really digging down into the how. So here we have Leilani from Harris County Toll Authority. Next we have Tamika from the city of San Antonio. And then we also have Michael Bryant from TxDOT and Damian Pantoja from City of Austin. And I'll let you guys introduce yourselves, but I'm asking two questions for the day. The first one is, how have you begun to define equity within your programs and respective work? And particularly, how are you using data to drive your strategy? And then what does success look like? So Leilani, I'll let you go first on introduction and taking us out with the question.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for having us again. Leilani Thielen, again, the interim uh, deputy director for operations and facility infrastructure, aka Hectra Maintenance. Um, so let's start with the how do we define equity.
Mhm.
Um, so at Hectra, we're in the business of building connections. As I mentioned before, we're not only building physical connections, we're building connections between neighborhoods, socioeconomic connections. We have to look at it in a wider perspective. So we are committed to build these broader community connections in that way. And we need to increase opportunity and these types of connections. And so we see equity in that lens of let's increase opportunity and provide opportunity where there was none. So are we answering both questions now or?
I think we should go through the line and
Okay.
on how we're kind of approaching it and
Awesome.
then talk about
Well,
success after.
sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Athena. Tamika Monterville, Director of the City of San Antonio's Transportation Department. And how we use equity in data. One of the great tools, one of the reasons why I came to San Antonio was because they have what's called a budget equity tool. So if you're a director of a department, you have to show how all of the programs and projects within your department will advance the needs and resources of those who are low income or communities of color. And that's really important because we don't always go to work and like, oh yeah, I'm going to do this project and I'm going to impact the lives of low income and communities of color. That's not what you do when you have a project. So the data that we have is our equity atlas, which many of you probably utilize. So in keeping with the Biden administration's Justice 40, we can actually take the data from our equity atlas. We have data related to race, income, high school education, also redlining history. And all of this data is what we use to inform how we plan and prioritize our projects. Because my philosophy is if you serve the least, you're serving the most. So the data that we utilize is from our equity atlas.
Good afternoon. I'm Michael Bryant. I am the Director of the Civil Rights Division at the Texas Department of Transportation, and I also serve as Chair of the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials Committee on Civil Rights. I think at TxDOT, I think we are less focused on the efforts to define equity in big formal plans. And it really comes down to, as you mentioned, Athena, the implementation. All the documents in the world don't do anything if you're not actually actualizing what you've put down on paper. Our vision statement at TxDOT, I think you probably heard Mark Williams talk about our vision statement or our mission statement, connecting you with Texas. Our vision statement talks about mobility. It talks about economic inclusion and improving the quality of life of all Texans. And so I think when we are achieving those things in that vision statement, we are actually on a path towards equity. And certainly from the civil rights perspective, and this has been something that we've talked on the national level, as many state DOTs, there are some that have implemented equity plans, but it's a question of bringing in new people who are the equity experts when you have existing teams of people and people who put in years in implementing the civil rights programs that all trace back to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VI, which is essentially non-discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin. And from Title VI, you move into environmental justice. You move into so many other programs, including the ADA, and how we do those things on a day-to-day basis. I would say is more equity in action than equity simply in writing.
You. Can you hear me? Awesome. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Damian Pantoja with the Office of Civil Rights here at the City of Austin. That's a great intro for the Office of Civil Rights, even with the Transportation Department, because it's exactly what we do, but at the ground level. And the way we define equity is not so much on paper, but it's within our systems and our practices. And what I mean by that is if we are directed by city council, city manager to create an ordinance of some sort, we then have to look at who's the target audience, how does that community engage, and how do we insert ourselves into that community to then gather that data, that feedback that's required of us to create this draft, because we don't want to create a system or a process that doesn't benefit that target audience. So the question was,
Using data, how you define
and
equity.
then that's how we define it. So using that data then allows us to connect with the policymakers, the decision makers on how this will be implemented within the city of Austin.
So I'm really glad you guys are sitting together, because when we had a cuddle, we were wondering, equity is kind of the outcome, the goal of what we started with, the commitment around civil rights. And so one of the things we wanted to kind of get into, I was talking to Tamika about this, is how are you, Damien and Michael, kind of towing the line between the commitment of civil rights and then bringing it to an equity conversation? How are you? Are you engaging with that? Are you having challenges?
It's not easy. I will say that. Because when it comes to the civil rights, we have to have tough conversations. So I'm going to use Austin, for example. I'm not going to assume that everyone here knows the history of Austin. We had a city plan enforced in 1928, which has a domino effect to today. And when people talk about, well, let's reverse that, let's talk about affordable housing, even though that's away from civil rights. Let's talk about access to healthcare, again, away from civil rights. I then say, well, we have to go back to the policies in place that were created that allowed for the decisions to occur today. So if, the recent one would be evictions. We're seeing a lot of evictions occur on the east side of Austin, which are predominantly working class communities, communities of color, but then they can't go anywhere else. Well, that was because once upon a time, that was the only place they could go. So from us, we're looking at how can we redo that policy, and how can we work with our council and our leadership at the city level on to provide a pathway to undoing what happened then, which ties into discrimination, which ties into other type of Title VI laws that we have in place. And one example that I'll give real short also is the public housing. Public housing in the 40s was not built to be ADA compliance, but yet we still have them up. So that is a form of discrimination within itself, because the housing that's created on the east side wasn't up to ADA compliance. How do we do it now? Because people are living there now.
I think a lot of it, in terms of how we go from what we're talking about, like in our division, within the larger context of TxDOT, is really looking at how TxDOT is divided. And so there are 25 districts across the state, and when you get into some of the real issues, it's really a matter of a local and a one-on-one sense of what the issues are on a particular project or community, what those impacts are, what people think should be the answer. And so we've had two major Title VI delays on projects. One was the Harbor Bridge project in Corpus Christi. One is the current North Houston Highway Improvement Project. And so while that one is currently on pause, when we're working to address whatever the issues are in a complaint or in any sort of communication with the Federal Highway Administration, it's really going down to those issues. So some of the things that Damien talked about, like housing, each of the projects that I mentioned had an issue with um, federal housing for local residents that had to be addressed. A lot of it's working with cities and what they are doing. Some cases, what those cities aren't doing for their citizens, and how TxDOT can implement some of that change. So, for instance, if we were doing a project and we're about to go into the summer, and there's a pool that might be impacted, we might try to work around making sure that pool is there for those residents to have a safe place to go cool off in the summer. Obviously, everything with energy and the grid and all that kind of stuff that affects people in Texas. Um, but that's a ultimately a local decision, but we can influence some
Mm.
of that with what we're doing. Also, because obviously, with all the money that's been talked about today, there is a greater impetus on TxDOT and especially our district staff, who are the local component to what TxDOT does, to engage with the community, making sure that the notices go out, making sure we're providing information in the languages of the people in that community. So it's not just throw it all out there in English and not just go, oh, hey, we put it out there in Spanish too. If we know that there's a community that speaks Mandarin or a community that speaks Hindi or whatever language they speak, we have to be able to address that and provide services to all those people. And making sure that not only can we communicate to them, but that when we're listening, we're able to understand what they're telling us and then act on those responses and be responsive in the sense that somebody might not like your answer, but if someone asks you a question and you never respond, is probably the worst thing that we could do. So at least if we go, hey, you don't like this design, tell us what you don't like. We take that information in, and Austin is an example of that with the 35 project, and trying to work with the community by providing, hey, we got some of these ideas. Here's what those ideas would do or not do. And while we may still have our desired plan, we're still taking that feedback and trying to see where we can make some things so that we can basically get and a better consensus to move forward with that project.
I hear you. Before we get to more of the project program perspective, what advice would you guys have for others who are in that forefront of policymaking to change or to enable more equitable programs to take forth? I heard you talk more about access and giving more feedback mechanisms. Is there anything else you would recommend?
I think a lot of it, from the civil rights perspective, in
Hmm.
my staff, our goal is to try to educate people where we meet them. And so while a lot of our outreach is focused on what I would call contracting equity, so the disadvantaged business enterprise program, the state's historically underutilized business program, when we go out and meet people, we're going to get feedback on everything. And so we, in taking our mission of connecting you with Texas, are trying to um, get people engaged with our area offices. So there's a district office in the 25 districts, but then in many of the counties there are area offices, there's maintenance offices, and trying to make sure that we get people to the right people. It's one thing for someone to have an issue and come talk to me and yell at me for an hour, and then
Hmm.
I can tell them to talk to somebody else, and they either they do it or they don't. But the reality is, I've got to make sure that that person knows who they need to talk to, and that goes for my staff, and hopefully that's something that we are doing across the agency. I think there are so many things, and again, a lot of it was talked about today. But when you're talking about a 10-year plan, and there's a plan, going to 2050, and there's 4-year plans and different plans, people have to know where that information is and what it means. And so that's about, again, the access to people to help people understand what you're doing, because I can't read an engineering plan to save my life, and I won't try. So it's really about getting people, and it's getting TxDOT staff too to understand how to educate people and talk to them in um, not just a language, but in a style that they will understand. So you're not just talking, I'm a lawyer by background, so they would say legal ease, but it might be engineering ease, and getting to a point where you're having a real conversation so that, if I live on this corner, what does that project mean for me, and how do I living my life and my quality of life will be impacted? What are the things that will impact me, and what things can you change or not change so that I can understand how to either raise opposition or say, maybe I kind of support it.
Hmm.
But still to then also hope that that person reaches out to their neighbor who couldn't make that meeting, or their neighbor who, may have challenges understanding English, or understanding, who may be someone with disabilities, how they can understand what that's going to do for them as well.
Great. Damien.
Thank you for that explanation. It was really great because it's very similar to what we do. The only thing I would add is the following would be to transparency. Be transparent on what the end goal is of the project or the initiative, but also in having that transparency, you need to have the general public needs to have access. So truly understanding that it's not just I posted on the website, it's good enough. No, there's other avenues, other ways to educate and inform what's happening. And these are people's lives that we're talking about. If it's impacting you, whether it be the water, the infrastructure, mobility, healthcare, whatever it is, and it affects you and you are not aware, then I'm not doing my part as a civil rights office for the city, ensuring that you're staying informed, you're staying educated. But at the same time, if I am providing those resources, is it transparent? Is it simplified? Because legal conversations and legal language is not the same as common day conversations, and they also don't translate. So if I'm a native Spanish speaker, I can't say the same legal language in Spanish that I would in English because it doesn't translate exactly the same. So that's what I would add to what was already said.
That's phenomenal. I think that your threads of transparency and reaching out to community development are really, or your constituency really helps guide programming, scoping. And so I know Tamika just won a really wonderful Safe Streets grant.
Woo!
Yes.
Woo! We got the money, y'all.
Yes.
Y'all don't know. I'm real happy about that.
So
Could y'all tell I'm a little happy about the money? Woo! Wake up. $4.4 million, y'all. That's really important. And the reason why that's important is because it's the Safe Streets grant. The first year, we in the city of San Antonio, I inherited a Vision Zero action plan. And so as many of you know, in order to apply for an implementation grant, you had to already have a safety or a Vision Zero, some type of safety plan. We were successful in that we had that plan. And really what our team did was just built on that plan. When I arrived 2 years ago, when the department was created, we established what were our high injury network corridors. And really letting data drive your decision making is really, really important. You have to be able to tell a story with these grants. We've talked about the money. Michael talked about it's so much money out here. I just want to write grants all day. But we don't have time to do that. But when you let the data guide your decision making, it helps you develop your priorities. So we know in Texas, we're winning at something that's really bad to win in, and that's pedestrian fatalities and serious injuries. But what we have in San Antonio is our communities of color, because of the lack of equity, we're disproportionately impacted by the loss of a life. So we know in San Antonio that the typical victim of a crash, pedestrian or cyclist, and in automobiles is a middle-aged Hispanic male. So we're in Texas, in San Antonio, where it is a very patriarchal community and a history and the culture. And so if I have a middle-aged Mexican American who is living in the southwest part of our city and he dies, that's the economic vitality of that family for the rest of their life. So when you look at the economics of the data and you look at the redlining, the history, what rises to the top was Zarzamora, which is the corridor where we plan to install 8 mid-block crossings, pedestrian refuge crossings. And what's really critical is that we looked at all of our high injury network corridors, the top 10. Now, Zarzamora isn't the most deadliest, Culebra is, but when we look at the economics of the community, we see that they have a higher disproportionate amount of poverty. They have the housing insecurity. They have everything that's negative that you could have in your community is along this corridor. And so that one rose to the top because, again, if we serve the least, we serve the most. So we're providing them with safe access. When they talk about reconnecting communities, another discretionary grant program with Bill, most people think about freeways. Talked about 35. But we're just talking about a road. And when you look at Zarzamora, a lot of the corridors in our city, these roads are the width of highways and they are disconnecting communities. So I think we have to really think about operationalizing our roadways to make them safe, to make them attractive, because they're connecting the community. If we install these mid-block crossings, this is a 12-mile corridor. There are approximately maybe 50 to 70 signalized intersections, but there are neighborhoods between them. And there could be a half a mile between signalized intersections. So people in neighborhoods can't even cross the street because we don't have crosswalks. Because again, when we look at the history of our communities, these were the places that were the least. They did not get the striping. They did not get the crosswalks. They did not get illumination. So we plan to operationalize equity and making sure we address this corridor, because if we do that, we can help people get across the street, connect to the schools, connect to the churches, connect to jobs, to transit. And that's how we are going to take that 4.4 million. But the other piece of that is a safety and education campaign. We know proven FHWA, proven safety countermeasures. We know that we can improve the lives of people with education and enforcement. And enforcement is a tricky thing when we talk about equity. So you got to be real about what are the issues with your police departments in enforcement and what type of enforcement is it? We can all appreciate police with the radar gun during the rush hour because that's the time. But in the middle of the day, when it's very subjective, that's what we have to watch out for. But combined with the safety campaign, billboards at the bus stops, placards, or what do you call them in the yards? People putting these on their yards, reminding people to be safe and checking yourself, checking your friends. Since I've been a director of transportation, I drive hella slow. Okay. That's real talk. Just be honest about our behavior and making sure that we use that data, we take that data and we apply it, and we apply for those grants with the data that supports what we're asking for, and we're ready to implement when the time comes.
Wonderful. And congratulations on getting the grant.
Thank you.
Yes.
We're going to get some more money too.
Yes,
Athena.
operationalize equity. That should be a slogan. Leilani, so to explain how you're defining equity in your group, or just what programs you're working on right now.
So I could give you some examples. We don't have a definition for equity because it's so broad based, but as I mentioned before, increasing connectivity and making sure that we take into account the public before we get into design, that increased I want to say opportunity for actually translating that information to the public and making sure that we get that input and that data, so that when we go to design, that we have already taken that input into that design.
So what
and
are
make
some
sure
of
that
the
we can
top
connect.
programs and projects you're working on right now?
Well, we have different ones based on our actual people.
Mhm.
So, for example, we have a Hector Opportunity Academy, which started, and we actually take the community that lives on our around and surrounding toll roads, and we partner with agencies that can provide us with candidates to actually train them and put them through a training course, maybe get some studies, some certificates that they maybe didn't have opportunities to get before. And then at the end of that program, they can actually be hired into as a full-time employee with us. So that program was, I think it won an award. It's actually,
Congratulations.
yeah, it's we're really really proud of that. And we also just try to just our barrier free Hectra and tollways to trailways project. So barrier free Hectra is what we're calling our all electronic conversion. Um, our tollways to trailways is part of that, and that actually relates to what Tamika was saying, where we built these highways, these tollways in areas that had nothing before. Now we have sprawling communities all around them. And the thought process wasn't put into place of what you do with the outside to actually allow pedestrians and connect neighborhoods that now are across the tollway that have no way to connect to each other. They have to cross, 20 lanes of traffic, right, under an intersection. Is that safe to do? So we have that tollways to trailways program is really interesting and dear to my heart. So we can maybe get some bike trails connected, and pathways, crossings that we could connect our neighborhoods and our communities in that way.
Wonderful. Okay. So, last big question. What does success look like within your programs? Sort of, Damien, you look like you're thinking hard over there.
Uh, I can start.
Okay.
So part of that was the community engagement. Just last night we had a community engagement workshop with our community over our Hardy Downtown project. We had over 200 people show up to provide input for that project. That input is going to get integrated into the vision for that project, and we can do things like what Tamika was saying, provide design it in a way that it provides more um, community engagement, more parks. We don't just have to build pavement and a bridge that will cut a community in half. We can actually connect the community. We also have a new toll policy that was accepted. Well, it was passed by Commissioners Court in January, and this will provide reductions in our toll by 10% if you have an account with us. And then what that does is it helps those that have accounts, but we also recognize that it's hard for all types of um, socioeconomically challenged communities to maybe get these accounts in the first place. And so we're going to actually lower the price and cut that in half so that we provide that opportunity. We're also going to make sure that we still take cash, for those people that maybe don't want to set up an account or a bank account, but can still get and use our tollway without violating. So it's extremely important to be conscious of all of that within
Mhm.
equity and how we look into moving into the future. So
Great. Thank you.
So success will be 8 installed pedestrian refuge mid-block crossings on Zarzamora. But what's really important is that it's not your mama's mid-block crossing. It's not just concrete jungle out here. Engineers, y'all hear me? We're not doing that anymore. For those who are not engineers, the key is that this area also suffers the most worst of everything. So urban heat island is real. The airport team talked about sustainability. We talked about it earlier today. So with these 8 mid-block crossings, and this is a story you have to tell when you do these applications, the climate action plan that the city has, we have all the data. 1/8 of an acre of green space will be added if we are successful in putting these new mid-block crossings with greenery, with trees. I mean, oxygen. It's kind of a big thing. So, it's really going to help us change what these communities look like because they won't just be asphalt and concrete jungle. You know, there's studies that show that your space influences how you feel, how you act, how you engage with people. So to think about children being able to cross a street and seeing a native plant in a pedestrian refuge crossing, having pedestrian hybrid beacons, being able to stop a vehicle by pushing a button and having illumination. Tom here from TechStop from the research program, we talked about raised crossings. All of these things are really small things when you think about our lives, but this small thing can change the trajectory of a life. When you look at the lifespan, that's success. If we can increase the lifespan of people in this community as a result of this project, that's success to me.
Well, first, I want to hope that I have Tamika's energy at 5 o'clock all day, every day going
Thank
forward.
you.
I think there are so many different components to it. And I'll just focus on the economic inclusion part. In fiscal year 21 was the first year that TxDOT or any state agency spent over $1 billion with hubs. And so that for us was a significant achievement that we had been trending for the last 7 or 8 years. And it's more than double what we were doing 8 years ago. And so while we're proud of that on one hand, we also know, like many agencies and many agencies across the country, that Black contractors are severely underrepresented in public spending. And so we know we've got to do more work to make sure that those firms are part of the process. I think as a person who's become a primary caregiver for my dad, issues related to accessibility for people with disabilities has become even more important. Before I became his caregiver, I started getting Braille on my business cards. And it's probably one of the best reactions we get when we go anywhere. Because even though I've never given it to a person who can actually read Braille, I think and I think what we're trying to do is show that we are trying to make sure that we're inclusive. Because when we have tried to add some accessibility aids at meetings, and people said, well, have any people with disabilities come to the meeting? So why would we waste our time doing it? It was like, well, if you do it, maybe they'll actually come because they know that TxDOT is an agency that actually cares about them to have certain things in place. Doesn't mean we have every single auxiliary aid in place, but there are some that we have to be prepared to do, such as translators, such as being able to get documents to them in Braille, especially if we receive a request, but also making some of those documents that we know we're going to get the request, having those ready so it looks like we are on top of it and not being reactive and doing more things proactively, again, to engage. And the same thing with all other languages in programs. And I think one of the things that Tamika was talking about from a traffic safety standpoint is there are a lot of people in TxDOT across all the divisions and districts who are doing things on a daily basis that they don't necessarily perceive as equity. And so we are trying to make sure that we're documenting and capturing those things to illustrate to people there are things that you're doing because you know it's the right thing to do without labeling it as equity, but it's because it's going to make your job better and the people that you serve are going to have an improved quality of life.
For our office, it's to provide protections at the city level for all citizens in Austin. No, it does not matter your identity, immigration status. And by doing that, the success for us looks like finding all of the federal and regional statutes, such as laws in place, policies in place, finding the loopholes that allow discrimination to occur, and trying to find a resolution to block that locally. If there's a statute that allows right now, for example, in the state of Texas, if you have employees of 15 under employees, you are exempt from a lot of discrimination laws. As this means that discrimination could occur within your small business and your employees are not protected because of this statute at the state level. Well, my job is to go with the legal team, do some research, and how do we close that loophole here locally so that coffee shop down the street is not mistreating their employees. So that's what success looks like for our office.
Thank you. It's wonderful. We're at the end of our panel, but I think all of us collectively want to say again that equity is neither a blue or red issue. It's nonpartisan in so many ways, and it's about really rethinking the problems that we're all tackling and redefining the challenging on a policy level, understanding the systemic barriers that are causing loopholes or things that stymie the program, letting data as strategy kind of define the grant making opportunities, and then to your point, really looking at your customer segments and saying what do they really need and how do we best serve them. So thank you all. If you have any questions, all these wonderful panelists will be available for conversation afterwards.